Welcome back to another video for my Outlander project. This is going to be the making of the skirt, or I guess it's the overskirt. I'm not sure what the technical name for it is. The pattern I'm using is a McCall 7735 pattern, and the fabric I'm using is this gorgeous Italian cotton velvet plaid, I guess tartan, from Burnley and Trowbridge. They have amazing historical fabrics. I'll leave a link in the bio if you're interested. This particular fabric has a very subtle tartan pattern that sometimes you can't see in certain camera angles, and sometimes the camera really doesn't like focusing on it, so it might change, but this is a pretty good representation here of what the tartan pattern looks like. When cutting out fabric pieces in velvet, you have to be very careful that all of your skirt panels are going to have the same fabric direction, because velvet has two different naps going each direction. So it makes you not be able to be super economical with your fabric, but it's worth it. And I didn't pay attention to tartan matching the pattern because I wasn't sure how much fabric I was going to have left over. This particular skirt pattern has 3 front pieces and 2 back pieces. The skirt was designed with 1 back closure, and I really wanted it to be 2 side closures that tied, but I couldn't decide how to best do that with an uneven amount of panels, and the 3 panels in the front were bigger than the 2 panels in the back, so those 2 seams wouldn't be on the sides, they would be nearer to the butt, which is all wrong. And I didn't want to cut just like right in the middle of a panel because it wouldn't be very structurally sound, so I just accepted that it was going to be a back closure and I just followed the pattern. Also with these skirt panels, I cut them out with 3 extra inches of length on the end just to be on the safe side. This is my general PSA that you should always make sure you have enough fabric before doing something like this, adding length. Thank the Lord I had exactly enough, exactly enough fabric to cut out my last piece. For the long panel seams, I took to Instagram for advice on how best to finish them off. The consensus seemed to be French seams, which takes a little bit of extra time but does a really good job stopping the seams from fraying, which is a great idea because this fabric really sheds a lot. The French seam is achieved by first sewing the wrong sides together using a smaller seam allowance, turning the right sides together, ironing the first seam flat, and then sewing another seam to encapsulate all the raw edges from the first seam. This creates a nice and tidy seam finish. For all of this, I was using a walking foot on my machine, which I had because my first sewing project was a quilt. I thought it would be a good idea to use it because this fabric is pretty thick on its own, and I knew I would be sewing lots of layers of it together, especially during the waistband part of the project. I did make some mistakes doing this. I didn't trim down the seam allowance after sewing the first seam. I thought I sewed it narrow enough, but when I flipped the second seam back out, some of the fabric was poking through the seam that I sort of had to pull out with some tweezers, but it's okay and you can't really tell anymore. And also I did this without ironing because after reading online, ironing without this sort of needle pegboard can crush the velvet. And I definitely didn't have that, so I was terrified to iron this fabric where you would be able to see it and when not 100% necessary. So going without it made my seams a little bulky, but that's okay. To create the back closure, I was actually dumbfounded by these instructions. I read them so many times and could really barely understand what was going on. But from what I gathered, you create this thing called a lap that is the overlapping part where the closure is, so your butt isn't on show or your undergarments on your butt. Even now watching this, I'm confused what I'm doing a little bit, but I'll try to explain as I go along. The pattern piece that is cut out is a long rectangle, and that needs to be the same length as the back opening spread flat. So I ended up having to sew up a little bit farther to make this match exactly. Once the piece of facing matches the length of the opening, you then need to pin it up as symmetrically as possible with the right side of that facing piece against the wrong side of the skirt. And then the free edge that you aren't sewing needs to be turned down to create the front when it gets flipped over. Probably could have done a little better job picking a filming angle where you can actually see what I'm doing. Oops. This facing piece is then sewed down with just a normal seam allowance. You can see a little bit here that when this got flattened to sew on, it turns out that my opening was a little bit too big for the pattern piece. So there was about an inch at the end that when you turn the fabric over to the front, does not have a facing. So I had to do some creative things to fix that later. So I just went for top stitching this on. I really don't know what the pattern wanted me to do, but that's just the most logical thing I could think of to do. This was a lot of layers of fabric here, so I was glad I had the walking foot to help them all move together, but even that didn't stop some potential issues from arising. This issue was mainly caused by my fear of ironing this fabric. I 100% should have ironed this piece flat when I turned it, which would have saved me a lot of hassle. As you can see, as I sew along further, this piece gets more and more bunched on the front of the needle that then pushes the fabric forward. And when this facing is folded together, it became super warped, and ironing it flat afterwards did not really help it, and I didn't have the heart to rip it all out and try again, so I just left it. It's okay, I guess. You don't really notice in the final product, but that is a big regret. Iron this part if you're gonna make this skirt. You can really see how twisted it is here. Like, that is not right. It should have been ironed down. The last step for this piece is to make a diagonal stitch at the bottom of this opening to encourage the pieces to stay together when they're closed. Moving on to the waistband, I did have to break out the iron for this because I got fusible interfacing that the pattern called for. And as I discovered, ironing didn't really hurt the fabric when I ironed on the wrong side at least. So that's a good face palm moment after messing up a lot of the stuff before because I was too afraid to iron. I just cut the waistband to match my waist measurements with the undergarments on, and then I folded the edges in and then in half to create a band that will sandwich around the top of the gathered skirt. Now to the skirt gathering. To get inspiration for how to correctly pleat or gather this skirt, I went back and I looked at a lot of Claire's skirts from the early seasons, and they all seem to be pleated the same. Or basically the same. They have what look like two larger box pleats on either side of the front. And then after those box pleats, they seem to be smaller knife pleats facing the back of the skirt around both of the sides. So that's what I decided to go with for this project. This pleating process took such a long time. I think I have like 3 hours of footage of me fiddling with it because I was sort of measuring and marking my pleats, but then I wasn't getting the pleats to fit nicely in my waistband, so I had to take things in and out here and there, and I tried to keep everything pretty symmetrical, but I had some of the pleats near the closure where I had to just like super deep pleat them or take out some pleats, so it wasn't very professional, but with this dark fabric, you can't really tell when it's done, and I think the end result is pretty good, in my opinion at least. One of the most important things that I was paying attention to was where the middle front of the skirt was, and that I wanted both of those box pleats to be exactly the same distance from the center, and then for the center opening to be the same size as those box pleats, about as close as I can get it, which looks pretty good here, but I ended up fiddling with it a lot later. And another thing that I definitely should have done was, instead of just doing one layer of pins right along where the waistband is going to sit, I should have also done a second set of pins a little farther down the fabric to hold it better while sewing the waistband on, which didn't do as much damage as it could have, especially because I didn't iron this. It could have really screwed me up. I'm not sure the best way that people do pleating. I know some people calculate it out, calculate exactly how big their pleats need to be in order to make the waistband fit on the skirt, but honestly I feel like it's much easier to just kind of YOLO it and then make adjustments to make it fit in the end. One thing I did try to pay attention to with the pleating also is hiding the seams, and that includes this back facing. I wanted it to be underneath a pleat so that there was more fabric to sort of hide how bulky and warped it was, which I think in the end did really help hide some of my mistakes there. Once I had my initial pleats in, I then just tried it on with no undergarments. I know, not super accurate, but it was close enough to see if I needed to let it out or take it in a little more. And after each try on, I ended up fiddling with it a little more, and I moved the box pleats in a little bit because I thought they were sitting too far to each side. At the second try on, I was much happier with the fit around the waist and that the two front box pleats were much more visible and also hiding the front seams better. P.S. The skirt hem was really long and I was stepping all over it, which is why I'm like walking like a hippo in this. To lock these pleats in place, I just ran a basting stitch down the very top of the fabric, and you can see here how super frayy this fabric gets at the end. Those little black dots of velvet were everywhere in my apartment. Everywhere I walked with it on, they were all over my bathroom, all over my carpet, which is definitely a hazard with working with this fabric, but it's so beautiful that it's definitely worth it. Now with the pleats basted in place, it's time to attach the waistband. And again, I started by matching up the middle mark on the waistband with the middle mark on my skirt to make sure that it would reach around either side symmetrically. And I was going to use a sort of lazy approach to this. I know a lot of people hand sew on their waistbands, but I went for the first edge right in the ditch of the fold I made in the waistband, and then turn it over the top of the waistband and then hand stitch it down on the other side, just to make it go a little bit more fast than it would doing it all by hand. Doing this stitch in particular is when it would have been helpful to have that second layer of pins that would still be in holding the pleats, because you can't really see what's happening on the bottom when you're sewing, and the fabric can get sort of pushed out of the way and create sort of a messed up pleat. Here's what the inside looked like when I had turned and whipped it down. I don't have any footage of me actually sewing this, but I just did a really messy whip stitch to secure the inside of the waistband. Now is when I could take a deep sigh of relief, because the skirt fits all the way around. There were no closures yet, but there was enough overlap to then insert the closures later, and I was so happy. For some reason, I didn't take any pictures or footage of the closure process, and I ended up just using 2 hook and eyes to close the skirt in the back. Not a very secure way to close it. These hooks and eyes were like vintage ones from my stash, but it's what I had on hand, and this was during the start of the quarantine, so I was trying to avoid going outside, and it'll work for now. I'm sure later I'll have to change it, but for now, it works. In order to finish this skirt, it needs a hem, which I have discovered is the world's hardest sewing thing to do on your own with no dress form. I tried pinning it up, doing like a video spin like I'm doing here to see if it's touching the floor, but to the rescue of my mom, a couple weeks later, she had me stand on a table and we hemmed it with a broom or a mop. And then she added those pins where it should end, and then I just folded the fabric in on itself twice, pinned that in place, and ironed it in place. And then I used a sort of hemming stitch. I don't really know what this is called. I saw it in some YouTube videos, but you make a really small stitch through the front fabric that is pretty invisible, and you sort of continue this little zigzag pattern along the stitch. And I ironed this flat, and it's a little visible. You can sort of see the band around the front when the skirt is on, but it's what I could figure out how to do, and I couldn't really find a better way to do it for now. And once all that hemming was done, the skirt is then complete. This is the final product, and the next step is going to be creating the jacket, which turned out to be the hardest thing that I've done so far. So tune in next time for the making of the jacket. Thanks for watching.